When you look at the Creek Nation and the territorial claims, none of it's in North Carolina. Here's a map showing the various land cessions and the various dates of those cessions. So by the time of the forced deportations that we see, beginning in 1836, 1837, there was only one part of Creek land that still sort of stood, and that's this area right here along the Alabama-Georgia line. That was sort of defined in the last session. 1827 is what left this parcel of land. In 1832, in that treaty, the Creek Nation, and there have been multiple small immigrations to the west before this, but there's still about 17,000 Creek citizens left in that area by that time. There are a few thousand folks who have gone west voluntarily under multiple, and this is the first I learned about Creek immigration, and it's very, very confusing for me. It's fits and starts, small groups, big groups, under all kinds of different circumstances. But after 1832, it gets really intense for these folks. By this treaty, the Creek Nation was essentially, their sovereignty was dissolved. This becomes, it's Creek lands, but it becomes Alabama. And Alabama extends its jurisdiction over these Creek lands. And by provision of this treaty, those lands are subdivided and Creek citizens are allotted. And they don't call it that at the time, but that's what it is. They receive their allotments of a half section. So heads of the Creek, Muskogee households, the upper part of the nation, lower part of the nation, everyone is allotted. Here's a map of some of the reservations in Chambers County. So they were really dense. They covered large sections. There were so many Creek citizens that the allotments really took up most of the best land within that area that had been Creek Nation. And here you can see sort of close-up, and you can see the records are really pretty amazing. We have each half section with the name of the allottee there. But the plan was, from the federal government's standpoint and the standpoint of the state of Alabama, that these allottees would sell their property individually and voluntarily remove to the west. In the meantime, any lands that weren't allotted were open for settlement within the state of Alabama. And this was overrun by whites, as were the allotted lands. There was a tremendous rush in. There was every kind of corruption and speculation and pressure put upon the Creek people that you can possibly imagine during this period. People were getting pushed off their allotments. People were getting cheated out of their allotments. There was a huge land boom that was going on, particularly in these cotton lands in Alabama at the time. And the Creeks were really being forced out. And you had a lot of people within this area who had just been forced out of Georgia by the earlier time. They hadn't even resettled. So they were really in dire stress, particularly among the lower creeks in the area of the nation down on the Chattahoochee River. So things were in tremendous turmoil for the people of the Creek Nation here after 1832, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And there's a lot of conflict then between white settlers, the Alabamians, I guess you say, the Alabama people, and the Creek Nation, folks of the Creek Nation. And so there's conflicts on an individual basis, and there began to be conflicts on a community scale basis as well. Conflicts, not just people getting their horses stolen, but people getting murdered, people getting beaten up, imprisoned. And particularly these lands getting overrun. It's especially bad in the southern part of the nation among the lower creeks. And there's an incident that occurs early in 1836. Now, the whole time there are small immigrations going on to the west. But early in 1836, there's a group of hunters from lower towns. These are mostly Yuchi folks. who have crossed the river, crossed the Chattahoochee River into Georgia, just in a camp, minding their own business, trying to kill a few deer, as they had always done. And they are attacked, ambushed, really, by a group of Georgians. Several of them are killed, their goods are stolen, they're run out. The survivors escape back across the river into their towns, and they tell everybody, and at that point, the folks in the lower towns were just over it. They're not going to take it anymore. And so there's a reprisal that's organized. They cross the border again into Georgia, and at that point, I did need to throw this in. This is a drawing by Basil Hall of a couple of Creek chiefs and a squatter on Creek lands. He came through that area right about that time and represented that problem. And he also drew these people as backwoodsmen and land speculators. These are the kinds of folks that the Creeks were dealing with, who were intent on making their money off of the Indians. So the pressure from these kinds of people on the Creeks, particularly the lower Creeks, and this incident that happens in that camp along the Chattahoochee sparks what becomes known as the Second Creek War. It opens up into full-scale conflict in the spring of 1836. And it catches fire. You have attacks of lower Creek warriors on plantations. You have reprisals and the organizations of militias in Georgia and Alabama, and you have a full-scale war going on. At this point in time, they decided to call the militants of the lower towns Red Sticks. And the federal government at that point in time, when they intervened, then suddenly the removal of Creek people becomes compulsory. This is what triggers the end of voluntary immigration and the beginning of compulsory deportation. And you have first the people who were classified as hostiles, as captured by American and state forces, are forcibly deported. The men, the lower Creek warriors who had been involved are carried in chains and begin their trip in chains to the west. Most of the war, rather than being like this, is more like this, with troops attacking Creeks and Creek camps. But that conflict and all of the turmoil that spins off of that conflict has, as people are being forcibly deported and pushed out of Alabama and taken to the west by the U.S. Army, it also has the effect of pushing refugees out of the Creek Nation. So the Creek Nation borders to the north, the Cherokee Nation. To the east, it borders Georgia. And we see at the outset of the Second Creek War, many of the lower Creeks fleeing down to Florida into the Seminole country, and they're classified there as runaway creeks or refugee creeks, and termed Red Sticks in writings of the Army. But many of the upper creeks, because this becomes a conflict that engulfs everyone, even though the upper creeks are actually involved with American forces in suppressing hostilities and actually in hunting down lower creeks to effect their removal. But many of the upper creeks flee into the Cherokee Nation to avoid this conflict. And so even before the war actually breaks out, as early as the beginning of 1836, you have hundreds of citizens of the Creek Nation fleeing across the border into the Cherokee Nation to take refuge there because they can see what's happening. And this greatly accelerates with the opening of hostilities in spring and summer of 1836. So if we look at the movement of these folks from Creek Nation, they're headed toward the area of Coosawattee, and from there up toward Red Clay and into the Hanging Dog Mountains in North Carolina. This is how you end up with Creek removal in North Carolina. So you have all these fugitives, these refugees, I should say, from the Creek War. They come into the mountains, and they come particularly into areas of the Cherokee Nation they expect to receive them well, in places where they have relatives. just a map to show you sort of the theater of operations here. Well, the influx of Creek people into the Cherokee Nation at this time, while the war is going on, and there's tremendous hysteria all across the South of Indian uprising. This idea of, the Creeks have broken loose, we're going to have open warfare, and then when you have refugee Creeks coming up into the Cherokee Nation, it really triggers some hand-wringing and really overwrought writings on the part of Americans in those areas. They're tremendously worried about what this means in the Cherokee Nation. The Treaty of New Echota has been signed. At this point, it hasn't yet been ratified. So we see, for instance, this letter from Isaac Baker. He's writing about the numbers of Creeks that have arrived and expect to settle there around Coosawattee Old Town. Maybe 75 or 80 folks who come from Terrapin Creek in Alabama. And particularly, what he says, he points out as he's writing to the governor, he says, threats are frequently made by the Cherokees, those opposed to the treaty, saying they will fight for their country before they leave it, and the Creeks will help them. So everyone's expecting that these Creeks coming in are red sticks, and that there will be open hostilities. One of the things of the Cherokee Nation is this sort of pan-tribal resistance to removal. It's supposed to be it's all made up. It's Fox News coverage. It's it's what happens. Okay, I'm sorry. You get this letter written to John Ross, and this letter is really amazing. It's written by Archibald Turk. He was kind of a hateful character anyway. But he writes to John Ross, he says, they're now at Red Clay, 80 Creeks waiting for your arrival to say to them what course they are to pursue. I am at a loss to know how those Creeks should be hanging onto your skirts so strong unless you have a preconcerted plan of war in your heads. And now, sir, in order to preserve peace if possible, I inform you that on the very first aggression on white settlements, your blood shall pay the debt. He's threatening the life of the chief of the Cherokee Nation over these Creek fugitives who have come in just trying to stay out of the way of the war. So this creates this feeling of unease among all these Anglo-Americans who are expecting to see all these native nations just sort of vacuumed out of the southeast and not see what's cropping up in Florida at this time happen. But they're very much of that mindset. And I think, and I believe very strongly now that I ran into this stuff, that this is what is informing the U.S. military expeditions in the Cherokee country. For instance, the expedition of Wool into Valley River later in the summer of 1836, where he confiscates the guns. It's because there's a request that there's Indians running around in the woods with guns. Well, it was a starving time in the Cherokee Nation. People were out hunting. They were trying to find something to eat. It was an awful time for the Creeks to come in the nation because there wasn't food around. But that's what drives the military in these expeditions, is this hysteria over the refugee Creeks. It takes a long time for the U.S. military to actually react to this. I mean, first they decide they want to suppress the Cherokees. But by 1837, there's been so many reports of Creeks sort of organized in camps and settlements that Wool brings in Edward Dease. He's just taken one party, just gotten off the river, taking one party of Creek deportees to the Indian nations, going up the Arkansas. He's come back, and Wool details him to be the superintendent of collection of the refugee Creeks, and to deploy officers in those parts of the Cherokee Nation where the Creeks are hiding. So he says that the troops will be furnished from military stations in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and North Carolina. And these are mostly state militia. That he is authorized to arrest these people and also to provide clothing and food once he's arrested them and begins to effect their removal or deportation. He also writes to Major Delaney at New Echota, talking about collecting the creeks at Red Clay. And one notable portion of this order to Delaney is that Captain Hembry will require the Cherokees to aid and assist him in collecting them. If they refuse, that is, if the Cherokees refuse to help the Army, they will be confined and the circumstances reported to me, and I will send a detachment and have them forthwith sent to the Agency for Immigration. This is patently illegal, but he is going to force the Cherokees to aid in this hunt for the refugee creeks. The hunt for the creeks in the mountains went pretty quickly. We know most about the capture of the people at Red Clay because we have eyewitness accounts where they've gone to, found a camp outside what is at this point the Cherokee capital at Red Clay, a camp of Creek citizens, and gone in pursuit of them. And the Moravian missionary Henry Clowder writes about that. He's telling about the armed guard. These are Tennessee Mounted volunteers coming through from Ross's Landing, and they are headed toward Red Clay. Says to catch some dozens of half-famished Creeks who fled into this nation and are said to be hostile. This is the usual cry among the whites here. Every Indian who happens to look cross, for which everybody knows they have reason, is put down as a hostile, bloodthirsty dog and must, forsooth, be called, I love it when they say forsooth, secured and dragged off like a galley slave on board the boats and sent to Arkansas to be happy and civilized under General Jackson's humane policy for the preservation of Indian tribes. And he further says that the next day he met a number of captured Creeks in the charge of the soldiers. Men, women, and children in single file, and he says a poor, miserable set of human beings, ragged and half-famished. He met a wagon carrying a lame woman who was crying, and then he says that some of the Creeks had resisted, and a few of the men had escaped. One old poor fellow, having defended himself with a bow and arrow, was shot down by one of the troops and left in the woods. During the night, it rained very hard. He said, I thought of the poor Creek in the woods who had sacrificed his life's blood in defense of liberty. And this is what they call the Battle of Red Clay, this sort of one arrow shot in one direction and a musket ball shot in the other direction. Became the Battle of Red Clay. You see a notice in the Athens newspaper on April 26th that it says, many of the Creek Indians having taken refuge among the Cherokees, the volunteers now under command of General Wall, have been sometime engaged in capturing and collecting them. Some 90 odd passed through this place last week under the superintendent of Lieutenant Day. A letter from Colonel Byrd, dated at Valley River, informs us that this coming were all arrested in 5 days. These are the folks who were hiding up in the Hanging Dog Mountains. It was about 90 Creek fugitives, and this is still the middle of nowhere in North Carolina, back up in the mountains. It was under the supervision of Colonel Byrd, direction of Captain Joseph Powell. They pulled these folks out and almost certainly take them into Fort Butler, there at Murphy, because that's the headquarters of Colonel Byrd, and prepare them to move first to the agency and then to Ross's Landing. So if we project that route for these folks as they travel through there, they go along. The folks who were caught in the Hanging Dog Mountains and probably the folks who were caught on Motley River go out the same route that's used the next year for the deportation of Cherokee citizens. What we see is that this operation really strongly informs the Cherokee people about the nature of what a forced deportation is like. If they hide in the mountains, the soldiers hunting these people down and preparing them and then pushing them out along these routes. These folks probably traveled, almost certainly traveled from Camp Huntington or Fort Butler down through Tellico Plains, Tennessee. We know they passed through Athens. They're taken to the agency, and from the agency, they're marched down to Red Clay, or down to Ross's Landing. The folks from Coosawattee were brought straight up to Ross's Landing. We don't know about the people who were hiding in Big Frog Mountain or the people from Red Clay, exactly what routes they took. They're taken down to Ross's Landing and prepared, put on flatboats then, about 300 people. And they're taken on flatboats down the river to Gunner's Landing. So they begin, and it takes about 4 days to make that trip, which is unusually slow for that period, and we're not sure exactly what's going on as they travel that stretch down to Gunner's Landing or Gunner's Ferry. But they arrived there on May the 7th, where they're assembled with other Creek fugitives who had been caught and brought into Gunner's and prepared then for immigration by water by Lieutenant Dees, who seems to be the master of immigration by water by this point in time. So long before he had really been heavily involved in the Cherokee removal, he was involved in the removal of creeks by the water route. You see this letter from Dees back to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he said they collected for immigration about 545 refugee Creek Indians that had been collected at this point, about 195 already before he brought down the people from North Carolina and the folks from Red Clay, and that at present, I think it would be most expedient to perform the whole route by water, going as far as the foot of Muscle Shoals by flatboats and thence to Fort Gibson by steam with large keels in tow. And that's exactly what they do. Dees also writes that there are a lot of people still left out in the woods. He doesn't know where they are, but they're not causing any problem, and they should be instead removed with the Creek people when that actually happens. Dees assembled everybody, made a muster roll of the party. So we have the names of the heads of families that are sent off in this immigration detachment. And then loads these folks onto 4 flatboats, 2 really large, like 80-foot flatboats, and 2 smaller 50-foot flatboats, and sends them down the Tennessee River. They start out there at Gunner's Landing on May 16th. By the next day, they're at Ditto's Landing, and when they stop there, a whole bunch of folks escape. Every place they touch land, all of these Creek folks just jump boat, and so there'll be 4 or 5 at a time. So he decided not to land much if he could avoid that. They head on down the river. They pass Brown's Ferry May 20th, and then they come to Lamb's Ferry at the foot of the Elk Shoals on May 21st, and they pick up pilots. They have to have pilots to make it through the Muscle Shoals, which is a major obstacle to river traffic there. They pick up pilots, they make it through the Muscle Shoals later that day, and then by the 23rd, they're down at Waterloo on the Tennessee River, where they engage a steamboat then to tow the flatboats. They get the steamboat Black Hawk, they attach those, get this ready to go, and they take off. They have a river cruise going at a high rate of speed at this point. They leave Waterloo on the 23rd. They're at Paducah by the 25th. They pass New Madrid by the 26th of May. And on the 27th of May, they pass right here at Memphis. Dees writes back that they pass the landing at Memphis in the wee hours of the morning. And they don't stop there because he said, we've made no stops. His intimation had been given that some of the Indians wanted to visit the Chickasaw country and would attempt to leave the party for that purpose. So he keeps under steam, and they keep going down the river, down the Mississippi, and they reach the mouth of the Arkansas. Actually, they take the White River cutoff on May 28th, and they enter the Arkansas River, and they start heading up into the head of the Arkansas country into the Indian Territory. They pass Little Rock on the 31st. There's a view of actually the Big Rock across the river from Little Rock. Then they pass Fort Smith on June 2nd. Here's Fort Smith. I love it. There are actually period paintings of all these locations. And they reach the mouth of the Verdigris River on June 4th. So this whole trip from Gunner's Landing to the corner of the Creek Nation is effected between May 16th and June the 4th. This is exactly the river trip that was anticipated for all of Indian immigration. The idea that all these folks would be taken by river, and it would take this 2-week period to get everybody through this. And of course, there were many complications that changed those plans. But this was under Dee's direction. It was really kind of a model for, if you have to have a model for forced immigration, for deportation, this was a model for it. Nonetheless, there were 80 people less fewer at the party by the time they arrived and they left with it. They only had 5 or 6 deaths on the way. There were a couple of folks who died of consumption at Little Rock. Most of the people had deserted somewhere along the way. And Dee's is like, by this point he was like, whatever. I'm done. He gets on a steamboat and heads on back home. The Creek folks get to the mouth of the Verdigris past, and I never know if it's the town is Verdigris or the river is Verdigris. I know one's Verdigris and one's Verdigris. Past Fort Gibson, and as soon as Dees gets there, he's unloading everybody, and they just take off. So he can't assemble them, give rations, do any of that stuff. They just leave. They run off into, back into the Creek Nation, where they join many of the Creek folks who are already there, friends and relatives that they know. And it takes a while to bring everybody back down there to try to do, all the technical logistical things that Dees is supposed to do. So here's their whole trip sort of laid out. I don't have a little segment from North Carolina on there, but their river trip actually starts at Rawson's Landing and ends there close to Fort Gibson. There's still many, many Creek citizens left in the Cherokee Nation, as Dees noted, and he said the Army was trying to continue to pursue these folks. By this time, Wool is out of command, and Colonel William Lindsay is in command of the military forces in the Indian country, or the Cherokee country, and the policy is beginning to change. We know we have a letter that Jack supplied. It's in the Gilcrease, and he calls up. We got a fax copy of it. So this is hot off the press, folks. A letter from Creek fugitives or refugees in the Cherokee Nation, and this is from August of 1837, after this winter was already out in the nation. But it's petitioning the Cherokee Council to allow them to stay. And they write, "We've come here to escape the evils of war. In time of trouble, we came to the Cherokees as to the home of a brother. But we've been pursued by the white man and treated harshly without knowing that we were guilty of any crime. 2 of our men were killed, 1 man shot through the thigh, and 3 children lost in the flight of their mother and have not been found. We do not want to be put into the hands of these men. We put ourselves into your hands. We want to live with you. We are willing to obey your laws. Most of our number are connected with the Cherokees by blood or marriage. We hope that the chief may obtain help for his own people and that we may benefit. But if not, we are willing to share the afflictions of the Cherokees," which most certainly they did. The Cherokee Council resolved then to admit the Creeks to reside in the nation until such time as they could overturn the Treaty of New Echota, or that forced deportation did occur for the Cherokee people. And as we know, several hundred Creeks went on the overland route with Cherokees on the Trail of Tears. There were many, many, many Muskogee people, Creek people in the Cherokee Nation in the West once they arrived. And in the early 1840s, the Cherokee Council passed a law admitting many of these people to citizenship in the Cherokee Nation. They elected to live with the Cherokee people. As they said, we want to live with you. We are willing to obey your laws. So they wanted to stay in the Cherokee Nation rather than return to the Creek Nation. So I hope that this has illustrated, again, a little more of the complexities of removal and the twists and turns that happen. It's not just sort of one group of people that is swept up and pushed out, but there are many, many sort of nooks and crannies and sort of strange twists and turns that happen in this great tragedy in this period. Thank you very much.